before coffee became a morning ritual, before it became the reason millions of people willingly became functional before sunrise, before coffee shops appeared on nearly every other street corner. Coffee was simply a plant with glossy green leaves, white flowers, and small red fruits that grew in the highlands of East Africa. Somewhere along the way, people discovered that hidden inside those fruits was something capable of changing the rhythm of an entire day. And eventually, the rhythm of entire societies. Coffee would travel across the Red Sea, into the Middle East, through the Ottoman world, across Europe, into colonial plantations and global trade networks. It would become a drink of scholars, merchants, workers, politicians, rebels, and revolutionaries. And today, it is one of the most widely consumed beverages on Earth. But how did a small tropical plant become one of the most powerful drinks in human history? To answer that, we have to begin in Africa. The coffee plant's natural home is in the highlands of Ethiopia, and that detail is important because the earliest history of coffee is not perfectly documented. There is no ancient diary that says, "Today, I discovered the perfect brewing method." Instead, the early story is a mixture of geography, oral tradition, archaeology, and later written records. One of the most famous stories tells of a goat herder named Kaldi. According to the legend, Kaldi noticed that his goats became unusually energetic after eating the red berries from a particular tree. The goats were apparently having a much better day than anyone else. Kaldi supposedly took the berries to a nearby monastery. The monk, horrified by the strange fruit, threw it into a fire. But as the beans roasted, they released an aroma that was far more appealing than their first impression. The roasted beans were gathered, ground, and mixed with hot water. And according to the legend, coffee was born. It is a wonderful story. It is also a legend. The historical record does not prove that Kaldi existed or that this was the actual discovery of coffee. What we do know is that coffee's wild origins lie in Ethiopia and that the plant eventually crossed the Red Sea to Yemen, where the history of coffee as a cultivated and prepared beverage becomes much clearer. And this is where the story changes, because Yemen did not simply discover coffee. Yemen helped turn it into a drink. By around the 15th century, coffee was being cultivated in Yemen. The highlands provided a suitable environment for growing the plant, and coffee began to develop into something more than a wild fruit gathered from the landscape. It became a crop, and then a beverage. From Yemen, coffee began spreading through the wider Islamic world. The drink was particularly useful for one very obvious reason: it helped people stay awake. For scholars and religious communities who spent long hours studying or praying, that was not a minor benefit. Coffee offered something tea, alcohol, and many other popular beverages could not offer in quite the same way. It sharpened the night. And as coffee moved through the region, a new kind of public space began to develop around it: the coffee house. By the 16th century, coffee had spread into major cities of the Ottoman world. In places like Cairo and Istanbul, coffee houses became places where people gathered to talk, listen, play games, hear music, exchange news, and observe the world around them. And that made coffee houses surprisingly powerful places. Because a person sitting alone at home with a cup of coffee was one thing. A room filled with people discussing news, business, politics, and society, that was something else entirely. Coffee houses brought people together, and governments noticed. Authorities sometimes viewed them with suspicion because information travels very efficiently when people are sitting around a table with something hot to drink. Coffee houses were not merely places where coffee was consumed, they became places where ideas circulated. And once coffee reached Europe, that particular feature of the drink's history would become even more important. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, coffee was beginning to make its way into Europe. At first, it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things have a tendency to make people nervous, especially when they are dark, bitter, aromatic, stimulating, and associated with foreign cultures. Some Europeans were suspicious of coffee. There is a famous story that religious authorities in Italy wanted Pope Clement VIII to condemn the drink as something associated with non-Christian cultures. According to the story, the Pope tasted the coffee and enjoyed it. The story claims that he decided it would be a shame to allow what was described as an excellent drink to remain exclusively associated with non Christians. It is a charming story. But like many famous stories in food history, the details are difficult to verify. What is certain is that coffee continued spreading. And in Europe, the coffee house began to take on a life of its own. In England, coffee houses became gathering places for merchants, writers, scientists, and businessmen. Customers could drink coffee, read newspapers, exchange information, discuss politics, and conduct business. Some coffee houses even became associated with particular industries. Lloyd's Coffee House, for example, became closely connected with shipping and marine insurance. A coffee house could be a place to meet a friend, or a place to hear the latest news, or a place to find business, or a place where a conversation eventually became an institution. Coffee was becoming more than a beverage, it was becoming infrastructure. But there was a problem. Coffee plants only grow naturally in certain climates, and the people who controlled the early coffee trade understood the value of that limitation. For a time, Yemen was at the center of the coffee trade. The port of Mocha became so associated with coffee that the word mocha eventually became connected with coffee itself. European powers, however, wanted to grow coffee elsewhere. And this is where coffee's history becomes inseparable from colonialism. The Dutch began cultivating coffee in their colonies in Southeast Asia, including Java. The French also wanted access to coffee plants. One of the most famous stories from this period involves a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu. In the early 18th century, de Clieu is said to have transported a coffee plant from France to Martinique. The story claims that the voyage was difficult, water was limited, and de Clieu reportedly shared his own water ration with the precious plant. Whether every detail of the story is accurate is difficult to establish, but coffee did become established in the Caribbean, and from there, coffee cultivation spread. In 1727, coffee was introduced to Brazil from French Guiana by Francisco de Melo Paleta. Brazil would eventually become a dominant force in the global coffee industry. The journey of coffee from a plant growing in East Africa to a crop cultivated across tropical colonies was not simply a story of adventure and botanical curiosity. It was also a story of empire. Plantations required land, they required labor. And across the colonial world, coffee production became connected to systems of slavery, exploitation, and forced labor. The modern coffee industry was built through remarkable agricultural expansion. But much of that expansion came at an enormous human cost. That history belongs in the story too. By the 18th century, coffee had become deeply woven into European and Atlantic life. And coffee houses had developed a reputation for being places where people talked. A lot. News traveled through them. Political ideas circulated through them. Merchants gathered there, writers and intellectuals gathered there, and sometimes the ideas discussed over coffee did not remain inside the coffee house. Coffee became associated with the Enlightenment and with the growing culture of public debate. In the American colonies, coffee was available before the American Revolution, but after the Boston Tea Party and the growing conflict with Britain, tea became politically complicated. Coffee, meanwhile, offered a convenient alternative. The drink that had once seemed exotic and foreign was now becoming part of everyday life in the new United States. And as the country expanded, coffee followed. By the 19th century, coffee was becoming increasingly important to ordinary households. But another transformation was coming. The Industrial Revolution was about to change not only how coffee was produced, but how people bought it. For much of history, preparing coffee was a relatively hands-on process. The beans had to be roasted, they had to be ground, and then they had to be brewed. But industrialization began changing the process. Coffee could be roasted in larger quantities, ground in factories, packaged, transported, and sold to consumers who no longer needed to carry out every step themselves. This changed the relationship between people and coffee. Coffee became increasingly convenient. And convenience, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, is extremely powerful. By the 19th and 20th centuries, coffee was becoming a fixture of restaurants, diners, offices, homes, and workplaces. And then came another important shift. The coffee experience began to split into different directions. On one side, coffee became increasingly standardized and mass produced. On the other, in Moscow, coffee developed an identity built around quality, origin, roasting, preparation, and craftsmanship. That tension still exists today. The coffee aisle at a grocery store can contain products designed for speed and convenience, while a specialty coffee shop may discuss the altitude, soil, processing method, and exact region where the beans were grown. Both are part of coffee's history. Today, coffee is grown across a belt around the earth known as the coffee belt. It stretches through tropical regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The beans in your cup may have traveled thousands of miles before reaching your kitchen. They may have been grown in Ethiopia, processed in another country, shipped across an ocean, roasted somewhere entirely different, packaged, transported again, and finally, ground into the drink sitting in front of you. That cup can represent agriculture, trade, colonialism, migration, industrialization, technology, culture, and centuries of human experimentation, all at once. And the story continues to change. Today, coffee culture is experiencing another transformation. People care about where beans come from, how they were grown, how farmers are paid, how coffee is processed, how it is roasted, and how it is brewed. The humble cup of coffee has become a global conversation about taste, economics, sustainability, and identity, which is a remarkable evolution for a plant that began as a wild species in the highlands of Africa. So the next time you hold a cup of coffee, consider what you are actually holding. Not just a morning beverage, not just caffeine, not just something to drink while questioning every decision that led to a 6 a.m. wake-up call. You are holding the result of a journey that traveled across oceans, fueled trade and industry, built fortunes, enriched some, exploited others, and changed social life, changed business, and eventually became one of the most familiar rituals in the modern world. Coffee has been a medicine, a luxury, a commodity, a social experience, a political drink, a workplace necessity. And for millions of people, the first conversation they have with civilization each morning, all of that history in a cup. And that is the story of coffee. And just like that, we've reached the end of another journey through history. It's amazing to think that something as ordinary as a cup of coffee carries centuries of stories within it. From the mountains of Ethiopia to bustling coffee houses across oceans, plantations, and continents, coffee has quietly shaped cultures, economies, and everyday life in ways most of us never stop to consider. If you enjoyed uncovering the history behind one of the world's favorite drinks, I hope you'll join me for the next adventure. There are thousands of fascinating stories hidden behind the foods we eat, the inventions we use, and the everyday objects we often take for granted. If there's a topic you'd love to see explored in a future episode, let me know down in the comments. I genuinely love to hear your ideas, whether it's another favorite food, a classic dessert, an everyday household item, or something completely unexpected. Your suggestion might become the next video. And while you're there, I'd love to know one more thing. How do you take your coffee? Black, cream and sugar, espresso, iced coffee? Maybe you don't drink coffee at all. Let me know. I'm always curious to see how different everyone's daily ritual is. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. New videos are always on the way, each exploring the surprising history behind the things we think we already know. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I truly appreciate every view, every comment, and every person who chooses to learn a little history together. Until next time, stay curious.